Hello and welcome to Robert Alter, Chapter 4. We're tracking with Robert Alter and his new translation of the Hebrew Bible with commentary. I'm having loads and loads and loads of fun with it, and I hope you are too. So please, let's keep going. Chapter 4. And the human knew Eve his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain, and she said, I have got me a man with the Lord. And she bore as well his brother Abel. And Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of the soil. And it happened in the course of time that Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to the Lord, and Abel too had brought from the choice firstlings of his flock. And the Lord regarded Abel and his offering, but he did not regard Cain and his offering. And Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you incensed, and why has your face fallen? For whether you offer well, or whether you do not, at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you is its longing, but you will rule over it. And Cain said to Abel his brother, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose against his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. And so cursed shall you be by the soil that gaped its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it will no longer give you its strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is too great to bear. Now that you have driven me this day from the soil, I must hide from your presence. I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, so that whoever found him would not slay him. And Cain went out from the Lord's presence and dwelled in the lands of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And then he became the builder of a city, and called the name of the city like his son's name, Enoch. And Irad was born to Enoch, and Irad begot Mehujael, and Mehujael begot Methusael, and Methusael begot Lamech. And Lamech took with him two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Adah bore Jabal. He was the first of tent dwellers with livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the first of all who play on the lyre and pipe. As for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, who forged every tool of copper and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, O hearken to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. A man have I slain for my wound, a boy for my bruising. For sevenfold Cain is avenged, and for Lamech 77. And Adam again knew his wife, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth, as to say, God has granted me other seed in the place of Abel, for Cain has killed him. As for Seth, to him too a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And it was then that the name of the Lord was first invoked. So this is a familiar story to most people who have ever been through Sunday school, the perplexing moment where Cain and Abel bring their offerings before the Lord, and somehow they feel, they understand, they know, they have awareness that God has either accepted them, as in Abel's case, or rejected it, as in Cain's case. So the whole kind of theological puzzle that gives us is kind of slightly beyond the scope of this video. So I'm going to talk about Alter's notes here in terms of his translation of them, and we'll see what we get to. So he says that the human knew Eve his woman, and since ever after, people have always used the word kind of know for have sex with, and he says the Hebrew word suggests intimate knowledge and hence sexual possession. Amos Funkenstein notes that it is the one term for sexual intercourse associated with legitimate possession, and in a few antithetical instances with perverse violation of legitimate possession, given the clumsiness of modern English equivalents like had experience of, or cohabited with, or was intimate with, and given the familiarity of the King James Version's literal rendering to know, remains the least objectionable English solution. So what he's saying is, this is a tender and legitimate way of saying sex, and it's not the same as fornication, which would be having sex with someone who wasn't your husband or wife, or adultery, which would be having sex with someone else's wife or husband. So this this term "knew his wife" is legitimate according to Alter, and I think that follows in most English translations. So what Eve says when she has a baby is, "I have got me a man with the Lord." Eve's naming speech puns on the verb qana, to get, or to acquire, or perhaps to make, and Cain, or which is we translate as Cain, the name. His name actually means smith, an etymology that will be reflected in his linear descendant Tubal Cain, the legendary first metal worker. Tubal also means smith in Sumerian and Akkadian. So this is a kind of a piece of ancient storytelling which sort of preserves the memory of ancient Near East people discovery of tool working and using metal, and it's sort of present not only in the Jewish Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the original biblical accounts, but it also sort of has a version in lots of other ancient Near East traditions, which is fair enough. So Eve, upon bringing forth the third human being, imagines herself as a kind of partner of God in man-making. So very much the sense is that God made the first one, Eve made the second one. And that is natural, that's in the text, definitely. And people from every culture have always credited God or gods with the origins of the first humans. That's probably not ubiquitously true, but I think most modern religions and most ancient religions would also kind of carry that same sense. And Eve here says, I've got me a man with the help of the Lord. Definitely it's if Adam's the only person available to be a midwife, for instance, that's got to be pretty seriously hard, and she would have needed God's help, I guess. So Abel, no etymology is given for Abel's name or why he's called that, but it has been proposed that the Hebrew word hevel, vapor or puff of air, may be associated with his fleeting lifespan. This kind of brings up an interesting point for me, because every so often the names in the Bible make storytelling sense. Think of the beginning of the book of Ruth, for instance, where there's a lady called Elizabeth and she has two sons, and their names literally mean like sicko and like weakling or something like that. And I guess we'll get to that when we get to the writings portion of Alter's translation. But sometimes the name given to the character in the biblical account is a sort of summary snippet of what that person's role within the story is. And that leads many people to suggest that probably these are late storytelling ideas that are parables, rather than historical fact. Now, I'm kind of into that because I think, well, actually, I don't buy it. Abel is this is his name. He may be called something, but English names are funny because English people call their children names mostly. We have some that are normal words, things like Willow or Ruby, often girls' names, that kind of thing. And in the Hebrew Bible, often the name given to the character has a sort of summary version of its total story. But Abel doesn't seem to particularly, and I think, well, maybe it's just because that was what his name was in the story and in the reality. But that's a note aside. So the widespread culture founding story of rivalry between herdsman and farmer is recast in a pattern that will dominate Genesis: the displacement of the firstborn by the younger son. If there is any other reason intimated as to why God would favour Abel's offering and not Cain's, it would be in the narrator's stipulation that Abel brings the very best of his flock to God. So the point is that Cain's offering probably was either what he had left over or just average, good enough type things, whereas Abel is careful to bring the very best of what he has to God. And so God has regard for Abel's offering and not for Cain's. Other people have interpreted this to say that Cain's later sort of divulging of his heart's terrible condition, jealousy against his brother, is the real reason why God doesn't accept Cain's offering. But I think Alter's right that the only suggestion we have in the story so far, before we find out that Cain's heart is full of evil and hatred, is that he brought the fruits he brought a portion from the fruits of the soil, whereas Abel brought the very best of what he had. I think that's fair enough. So verses 6 to 7, he says, this is the first of two enigmatic and probably quite archaic poems in the chapter. God's initial words pick up the two locutions for dejection of the immediately preceding narrative report and turn them into parallel utterances of formal verse. So It's like a poem to restate the main pieces of the story. The first clause of verse 7 is particularly elliptic in the Hebrew, and thus any construction is no more than an educated guess. Fair enough. The narrative context of sacrifices may suggest that the cryptic "say elsewhere preeminence might be related to the "maseit," a gift or cultic offering. Alright. Cain then kills his brother. He says, "Let's go out to the field on a little hike." So he says this sentence is missing in the Masoretic text. So the Masoretic text is a much later preservation of the Hebrew text of the scriptures undertaken by people following the end of the Second Temple period. So the rabbis and priests and scribes who kind of preserved the Hebrew language records of the Old Testament. The oldest copies we have from the Masoretes is about 1000 AD. So they are a late kind of group of scribes and chroniclers who preserve the scripture. And for a long time, people actually believed that the only Hebrew available was the Masoretic text, and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran offered the alternative, which was celebrated by linguists and Jewish people and Christians everywhere, because it lent authentic credence to the kind of preservation of the quality of the Hebrew in the originals, and B, the just archaeological significance of finding texts that had some variances. So the Masoretic text differs substantially from the Greek language text of the Old Testament, for which there are lots and lots of ancient copies, the Septuagint. And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us a sort of 1st century BC look at what Hebrew texts were preserved. And the comparison and the linguistic kind of fine-tooth comb that's involved with is far beyond my scope to contribute to. I have to kind of rely on everybody else's work for that. But what he says is that the Masoretic text, which is the main Hebrew text of the kind of original Judaism after 70 AD, he says it doesn't have this term, "let us go out into the field." It's just not in there. So Cain says, killed his brother. So in keeping with the biblical practice of using thematically fraught relational epithets, the victim of the first murder is twice called his brother. So the text is rubbing it in that he killed his brother, he killed his brother, he killed his brother. And sorry about that. And God will repeatedly refer to Abel in accusing Cain as your brother. You know, your brother's blood cries out to me from under the ground. And the sense is that Cain should know and does know and is told repeatedly that what he has done is particularly vile. Now, if you've got like the sort of reconstruction of this, which involves these people being basically the first people on earth and there aren't any more, there's a couple of issues that stand out that people love to harp on about. So go onto YouTube and look up who was Cain's wife. Go onto YouTube and look up how did Cain build a city. Go onto YouTube and look up who would have killed Cain if he was found by other people on Earth. And creationists and evolutionists have thrown this at each other for years. The creationist point is that Adam's first family didn't just involve Cain and Abel, but possibly many dozens of subsequent offspring. You know, by the time Cain kills Abel, maybe there's like, you know, years and years and years and years and years and years later, and everybody else alive would have been the kind of descendant of Adam and Eve directly. So the creationist point is that the genetic recipe of humanity is close to this whole kind of original that you see in Eden, and thus sort of having children with someone who is your sister would not kind of throw up the same problems that it does today. So smaller and more kind of localized populations in modern times, if you have children with your sister, or you know, if you're a woman with your brother, they're likely to have kind of problems with their genetic codes lining up in a bad way, and they're more likely to have great trouble with mutations and illnesses and hereditary problems. So it's interesting that God prohibits marrying your sister much later in the text in Exodus. But in Genesis, people marry their half-sister, people marry their sister, and that's just considered the normal way within the textual story of Genesis. So that's a point aside. Here we go. So, verses 9 to 12, there are several verbal echoes of Adam's interrogation by God and Adam's curse, setting up biblical pattern in which history is seen as a cycle of approximate and significant recurrences. So that the idea that, like, if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat it. And he's saying that kind of Cain's failure is Adam's failure, is all everybody's failure. Adam's being driven out from the garden to till a landscape of thorn and thistle is replayed here by God's insistence that Cain is cursed by, the preposition could also mean of or from, the soil, which had hitherto yielded out its bounty to him. So Cain was a good farmer before, and now the ground hates him because it drank up Abel's blood, which was spilt by Cain. So Cain is cursed as a farmer, and he has to wander around and be a nomad instead. The biblical imagination is equally preoccupied with the theme of exile. This is already the second expulsion. So Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden. Cain is now expelled from where he was. And the arduousness and precariousness of agriculture, a blessing that easily turns into a blight. I'm going to say no more about that as it is. Verse 11, the ground gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. The image is strongly physical, a gaping or yawning mouth taking in blood from the murderer's hand. So the earth is sort of seen as part of the trial. You know, it's a witness against Cain, who's in the dock. God is obviously the judge. And the ground is going, oh, I opened my mouth and had to drink down the brother's blood. And God said, well, look, the earth itself testifies against you. You are guilty. Cain protests, and he says, whoever finds me, and this and the subsequent report of Cain with a wife in the land of Nod are a famous inconsistency. Yeah, we've already dealt with that. Thank you, Robert Alter. Either the writer was assuming knowledge of some other account of human origins involving more than one single founding family, or because the schematic simplicity of a single nuclear family plot impeded the narrative development after Cain's banishment, he decided not to bother with the consistency. I think that is lazy scholarship. I think that the writer of Genesis has absolutely accounted for it, and the creationist attempts to defend it are stronger than the accounts of critics to undo it. I haven't seen anything from scholars that actually acknowledge it. You know, step back a bit. So the people who will say that the Earth is 14 point however long billion years old, and evolution and origin of the species is the reason why we're all here. They were often very, very critical of Genesis as an attempt to describe how people came to be, and they fall out a lot with people who are young Earth creationists who believe that this is literally the account of the origins of the universe and the species and everything in it. And so the creationists will make an argument line that sort of defends their position, and I think this is one that I haven't seen critical evolutionary responses to. So the creationists I've already described what their position is. I've never seen a evolutionary sort of liberal take that argument on. It always stays at this thing. It's like, oh, it's on an inconsistency. Who was Cain's wife? But it's like, well, all right, we know the creationist answer. What's the evolutionary response? And there doesn't ever seem to be one. So if you know of one, link me. I want to see it. God is going to give Cain a mark. It is, of course, a mark of protection, not a stigma, as the English idiom mark of Cain suggests. So God has marked Cain with a mark somehow that sets him out and protects him. So God's protection is on Cain. So you better not kill Cain, otherwise you'll have to deal with God. Cain goes to the land of Nod, and that is cognate with the word wanderer in verse 12. So he's a wanderer, he goes to the land of wanderers. That's fair enough. The builder of a city, the first recorded founder of a city, is also the first murderer, a possible reflection of the anti-urban bias in Genesis. That's a really interesting thing. So the Jewish and Israelite kind of status as a kingdom, as a land, sandwiched between larger empires is the sort of potted version of what the whole biblical history is. So Jerusalem and the kind of promised land is a small kingdom. Even in its golden age during David and Solomon, it is a small kingdom, and it's kind of stuck between the huge superpower of Egypt to the south and the massive and ancient powers of Persia, Babylon and such to the north and to the east, and the desert to the kind of Arabian southeast. So Jewish thinking, Hebrew thought in ancient times was suspicious of urban environments. You see it in Sodom and Gomorrah. You see it in the great cities of Babylon and the cities of the pharaohs, for instance, where the thinking is almost always hostile towards large centres of urban living. And what Robert Alter is saying is that is embedded in here in Genesis chapter 1. I'm okay with it. I think that's an interesting point. I'm going to skip over a couple of very, very technical notes here. This is probably beyond our scope. Okay, so Lamech. So the narrative context of this poem is a long lost, but it looks like a warrior's triumphal song cast as a boast about his wives. Unlike the looser form of earlier poetic inserts, the poem follows the parallelistic pattern of biblical verse with exemplary rigour. Each term of each individual verset has its semantic counterpart in the second verset. In the Hebrew, the first pair of versets has 4 accented syllables in each, and every subsequent verset has 3 accented syllables. Perhaps then, skipping over, what Lamech is saying quite barbarically is not only has he killed a man for wounding him, he's not hesitated to kill a mere boy for hurting him. So Lamech here is presenting as a bad guy. I'd agree with that. So Eve has Seth. The Lord has granted me. The naming puns plays on the similarity of the sound between Seth, Shed, and granted, Shad. So the Lord has granted me my Seth. He is. It sounds funny in English, but I can understand that this is the case. Finally, Enosh. This is also a common noun in Hebrew meaning man, and that conceivably might explain why, from the universalist perspective of the author, the name Yahweh began to be invoked in this generation. In any case, the narrative unit begins with one general term for human being, Adam, and in verse 1, and here concludes with another, Enosh, and these two words are elsewhere bracketed together in poetic parallelism. And the name of the Lord was first invoked, that is the distinctive Israelite designation for the name of God, Yahweh, represented in this translation according to the precedent of the King James Version as the Lord. So Robert Alter's agreeing with the King James that the Lord is the best kind of rendition of Yahweh. The existence of primordial monotheism is an odd biblical notion that seeks to reinforce the universalism of the monotheistic idea. The enigmatic claim here made with an atypical and vague passive form of the verb is contradicted by the report in Exodus that only with Moses was the name Yahweh revealed to man. Now, this again is standard liberal fare. This is critical fare. So the idea is that the most ancient religions were polytheistic, that gods like the Greek and Roman pantheons were primitive. The gods were not perfect. They were all kind of rowdy and they quarrelled with each other a lot, and occasionally they jostle for position at the top of the pile. And the belief is that somehow monotheism, the belief in only one God, kind of emerged out of that over a long period of time and was a late development. Now, what you've got is ancient documents. That's the only kind of way we can recreate that little setup. So if Genesis is very early, if these stories are very early, then monotheism is very old and original and primitive. And that does not fit with standard kind of anthropological, historical, linguistic kind of scholarly consensus. And so what Robert Alter's saying is that probably it's late. And I don't know, I think that there's a lot of evidence to say that these people, that this is a monotheistic text, isn't it? There's no one else who's a god in this text, and it'd be wrong to kind of insert gods into it or pretend that Yahweh is being made out to be any less than God. So Genesis 1 says Elohim, Genesis 2 says Yahweh Elohim, and here in Genesis 4 people are calling on the name of Yahweh and knowing him as such. It is a point that later on in Exodus, Moses has to learn the name of God over the whole thing, but that fits with the narrative story of kind of the authentic origins of life, the universe and everything were lost to the Hebrew people of the ancient Near East until the time they were sort of rediscovered by Moses, along with the kind of complete legal commands of Torah, which we're kind of readings from. So overall, I think interesting. I'm hearing a lot of kind of, maybe this isn't Robert Alter's own argument, or if it is, he's borrowing it from other people who've kind of covered this ground already. So in future videos, I'm going to try and avoid things where he's just sort of kind of reiterating stated positions of other movements, and try and hear him out as a translator a little bit more clearly. But that's it for chapter 4. Look for us in chapter 5. Like, share and subscribe. See you then.